Hi there, my name is Tyler Wedge, and I'll be talking a little bit about one of the famous English Puritan lawyers, Mr. John Winthrop. And before I get into a little bit about his life, I'm going to talk about basically his beginnings and his upbringings in life. So I'm going to get started here on a little bit of background information and a little bit about his early life. So John Winthrop was born in 1588 in Edwardstone, UK. And skipping to around age 15, he applied to Trinity College in Cambridge. And he did get accepted and studied law there. And then at age 17, he married the first of his four wives, Mary Forth, daughter of the Essex squire. And the next year, the first of his 16 children was born. Like many members of Winthrop's class, he studied law and served as Justice of the Peace, and he eventually obtained a government office from 1627 to 1629. He was an attorney at the Court of Wards in Liveries. For more than 20 years, Winthrop was primarily a county squire at Groton, with no interest really in any colonization overseas in America. He was a very religious person, and from his early teens, Winthrop threw himself into scriptural study and prayers, and gradually he trained himself into a full-fledged Puritan. Convinced that God had elected him to salvation, or in Puritan terms, to sainthood, his religious experience reinforced his outlook, but it also made him a social activist. Like other Puritans, though, Winthrop dedicated himself to remaking, as far as possible, the wicked world as he saw it, arguing that the life which is more exercised with trials and temptations is the sweetest and will prove the safest. So moving a little bit ahead, now during the late 1620s, Winthrop felt increasingly trapped by the economic slump that was happening in England, and they had reduced his income. This was mainly because Charles I, anti-Puritan policy, which cost Winthrop his court post in 1629. So later on in 1629 was when the Massachusetts Bay Company obtained a charter to basically put a colony over in the New England area. Now, Winthrop didn't have a job at the time, and he was really looking to express his Puritan ways. So he joined the company, and he sold his English estate and took his family to Massachusetts. If the company government and charter were also transferred to America as well. And the other members also agreed to these terms and elected him governor on October 20th. And now I will get into basically John Winthrop's journey over to America. So as Winthrop sailed west on the Arabella in the spring of 1630, he composed a sermon, which is one of his more famous sermons, called A Model of Christian Charity. And basically in this whole sermon here, he basically laid out to the Massachusetts colonists in covenant with God, with each other, and they ordered to build a city upon a hill in New England with the eyes of all the people on them. So they basically wanted to succeed in basically show everyone back home that they could actually succeed and do this with John Winthrop at the main point. And there's a couple famous lines here that John says. If we deal falsely with our God in this work we have undertaken and so cause him to withdraw his present help from us, we shall be made a story and a byword throughout the world. We shall open the mouths of enemies to speak evil of the ways of God and all believers in God. We shall shame the faces of many of God's worthy servants and cause their prayers to be turned into curses upon us, till we are forced out of the new land where we are going. Now, some of Winthrop's critics see him as a visionary, while others have seen him as a social reactionary, but most obviously he was urging his fellow colonists to adapt the combination of group discipline and the individual responsibility. That gave Massachusetts such immediate and lasting success as a social experiment. Basically, everybody working together, doing their part, and doing all the jobs and tasks that were laid before them, that everything got done in a timely manner. Now, for the remaining 19 years of Winthrop's life, he lived in the New England wilderness. He was a father figure to all the colonists there. And during the annual Massachusetts elections, he was chosen governor 12 times between 1631 and 1648. And during the intervening years, he sat on the Court of Assistants of Colony Council. His American career passed through three distinct phases. On first arrival in the early 1630s, he did his most creative work guiding the colonists as they laid out a network of organized towns, each with its own church and self-professed saints. Winthrop himself settled at Boston, which quickly became the capital and chief port of Massachusetts. His new farm on the Mystic River was much inferior to his former estate at Groton, but Winthrop never regretted the move because he was free at last and built a commonwealth. Optimism, though, against him built up after a few years. People didn't really agree with all his theories and whatnot. The person who started this outrage was Anne Hutchinson. She gained control over the Boston Church in 1636 and was trying to basically convert the whole colony to a religious position that Winthrop did not agree upon. It was he who led a counterattack against her, that being Winthrop, and his victory was complete. Hutchinson was tried before the General Court and was sentenced to banishment, basically. And now I will do a little bit more here, and also a little bit more to add on to the Anne Hutchinson story. Winthrop did write about the event of them in court in his journal in 1637. The court charged her with diverse matters, as her keeping 2 public lectures every week in her house, and for reapproaching most of the ministers, all except for Mr. Cotton, for not preaching a covenant of free grace, and that they had not the seal of the Spirit, nor were able ministers of the New Testament, which were clearly proved against her. And after many speeches to and fro, at last she vented her revelations, among which that she had it revealed to her that she should come into New England, and should here be persecuted, and that God would ruin us and our posterity in the whole state for the same. So the court proceeded and banished her. Now later on, Hutchinson was tried before the Boston Church and formally excommunicated. She established a settlement on what now is known as Rhode Island in 1638, and 4 years later, after the death of her husband, settled on Long Island Sound. Winthrop noted her tragic misfortunes, her deformed stillborn baby, and her murder by Indians as proof of God's judgment against her. Now, by 1640, Winthrop had become the custodian of Massachusetts, suspicious of new ideas and influences, and convinced that God favored his community above all others. In 1641, Winthrop went across the recent trend of accepting Native Americans and Africans into the church, which had a tie to the Great Awakening, and helped write the Massachusetts Body of Libertaries, the first legal sanction of slavery in North America, indeed. Winthrop owned at least one Native American slave, taken during the Picute War during 1636 to 1637. As slavery grew in New England, it was more typical for Native American slaves to be sent to the West Indies, where they were exchanged for enslaved Africans. And then with the outbreak of the English Civil War in 1642, many New Englanders returned home to fight against Charles I. Winthrop, however, stayed in America, and he criticized the course of the Puritan Revolution. His own political philosophy was best summed up in a speech in 1645, in which he defined the authority very broadly and the people's liberty very narrowly. But Winthrop was never a petty tyrant, and the colonists respected and loved him to the end. His tender side is best revealed by the loving letters he exchanged with his third wife, Margaret, who was his helpmate from 1618 to 1647. Most notable of his sons, John Winthrop, the younger, from 1606 to 1676, was a talented scientist and governor of Connecticut. After struggling 6 weeks with a feverish distemper, John Winthrop died at age 61 in the spring of 1649. By force of character, Winthrop had persuaded the colonists to adopt many, through by no means all of his pet social and political ideas. The detailed journal that he kept during his years in America is a prime source for the early history of Massachusetts, and his copious file of correspondence and memoranda gives an exceptionally full impression of all of his activities and personality. And now I'll leave you on one of his most famous quotes that he had, and it goes like this: "For we must consider that we shall be a city upon a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us, so that if we shall deal falsely with our God in this work we have undertaken, and so cause him to withdraw his presence help from us, we shall be made a story, and by word, through the world." Thanks again for listening to my video,